SealCast. This week I'm very excited. We got my good friend Alex Ortiz. Alex has worked as a chief blockchain evangelist for Life ID and currently sits on the board of directors at the Washington Blockchain Coalition. Thanks for being on, Alex.
Super excited to be here. Thanks so much, Seth.
And what's it like being a blockchain evangelist?
Yeah, so I love that blockchain is at such a young part of its storyline that having folks who can be basically like the eye in an API, right?
Yeah.
Like translating between people or between technology and people, building credibility in a space that's really new, right, and still maturing. I love that blockchain is still in that phase. And when I got into blockchain about a year ago, I was trying to figure out what's going to be the right path for me to end up working in this space. And when I was in between opportunities late last year, trying to figure out what would come next, I didn't have a super clear answer right away about what that would look like. But through conversation, eventually I came across these concepts like strategic alliance management or the importance of evangelizing technology. And that's what my work has been with the Life ID team this year, which is going out and building credibility around the self-sovereign identity and around the protocol that the Life ID team is working on. And so just kind of generally being a translator between tech and the infrastructure being built and what's possible, and going out and talking to folks about what it means.
Gotcha. So
we just jumped right into it. I love it.
Yeah. So what are some of the problems? Like, I know I've had an interesting time trying to talk to friends about the concept of self-sovereign identity. It's really, we're so used to the current model that it's hard to picture this idea of like what it looks like to actually control your data. So like, what are some of the issues that you've had like trying to educate people on self-sovereign identity and how this might work in the future?
Yeah, so the first thing that I had to learn early on was, okay, how do I define this in a way that's approachable? And it's a work in progress, obviously, right? But like all things in blockchain. But a self-sovereign identity is an identity that you own, and you can show that you own that identity, and you have control over the data that's contained within that identity. And so, let's juxtapose that with the modern world, right? So the internet as we know it, as this commercialized behemoth, has been around, say, since 1993. And in that time, the amount of our lives that we live on the web has obviously gone up precipitously. And so now we're at a point where between 93 and 2018, each person has accrued just a tremendous amount of digital identities and online accounts with companies. So you think about Amazon and LinkedIn and Twitter and Google and all these companies that we all use often. You have an account with each of those, presumably, right? And each of those is associated in a sense with an identity.
Yeah.
But today we don't own those identities. They're kind of like owned by the companies we create these accounts with, and we give them data, and they store that data about us, on their servers. And we can get into later why that sometimes is a problem.
It's a weird concept.
But self-sovereign identity kind of flips things around and says, and this is very futured, right? What I'm saying, but it's, let's create an infrastructure for identity and access management that puts the user in control and at the center, and gives them the tools to actually prove those identities are theirs, and gives them tools to create many different identities that they can keep separate from one another, and then also do things like get rid of passwords and give users a way to reuse credentials they've obtained, right? And so it's, I guess, it's changing the relationships that people have with these online-based companies and organizations, and giving users the control instead of the companies.
Yeah, that's a really exciting idea. Just being able to have control over your own data, and just sort of speaking to what self-sovereign identity is. One of the most useful things that helped me in understanding all of that was an explanation you gave me one time, talking about the difference between federated identity, centralized, and then self-sovereign. Could you repeat what those?
So during my learning journey, trying to get up to speed early on with Life ID and self-sovereign identity and the work of an evangelist, I came across a lot of really great resources. And some of those were around kind of the history of how identity is done on the web, right?
Yeah.
And so going back to the whole like 1993, like think back to the mid. I mean, we're both old enough, but we remember the early mid '90s and like America Online,
Yup, all
and
those AOL CDs.
and like all these things that were like back then super new. Like this is the world before Netflix, right? Before Google, before Facebook,
Yeah.
And around that time, we started to have this way to create online accounts, with things like AOL, et cetera. So think you're creating accounts, and those accounts give you access to stuff.
Yep.
And the information that you're giving those companies to gain access to stuff, that's kept on centralized servers, And so that's kind of like version 1 of identity on the web, was this really centralized way of managing users' accounts and data.
Yeah.
And some of that still extends to today.
Okay, so person gives their information to the company. Company puts it on a big database in server
For simplicity.
somewhere. Yeah.
For simplicity,
like that,
let's say. Now, remember, as the 90s progressed and the 2000s came along, a lot more internet-based companies came along, and we started using a lot of different services. So now we start creating a bunch of different accounts to access each of these services, right? So this is the world. I remember getting my first Gmail account sometime in like 02, 03, 04.
Yeah.
And so over time, the number of these kinds of relationships users have, where they've got a relationship with each of these companies and they've got an account with each of these companies, and that list of companies is growing. Around that time, now a new problem emerged, which was, how do we give users a way to log into all these different accounts in a way that's a little more user-friendly? And kind of out of that came this concept of federated identity, which is kind of you log in once, and then you can gain access to a bunch of accounts. So you don't have to manage as many passwords, let's say.
Yeah.
And I want to say that transition happened in like the mid to late 2010s, or 2000s rather, where now you have things like sign in with Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. And so that's like the federated model. You log in once, and then you federate out into other accounts that you've connected.
Yeah.
But that still means the user doesn't have control of their data. They still are going through some sort of...
Whoever has control, whoever you gave it to still says whether or not those third-party services can even use it to log in.
Well, they have to have those relationships. The company in between you and those other accounts still kind of knows some things about your relationships with those, and you still don't own and control.
Yeah, certainly.
So now we're at a point where there's enough technology in place that we could create a world where you could give each of those different companies access to your data in a way that's consented, in a way that you control, and companies don't get to choose whether or not you access through. You don't have to go through a middle party to access all those services, et cetera.
Yeah. So where I'm so excited about self-sovereign identity. Like the idea of being able to retain your data and have control over it is, it can solve so many issues from privacy and security across the board. It's really interesting. So, but I'm curious what this is actually going to look like. As we've seen, people got really excited over blockchain too, and one of the questions you always hear is, okay, so where are the applications? How do we use this?
Sure.
What can somebody actually do with it? I understand Life ID is going to be releasing an app, and it's an open source project. So what are you actually going to be able to do with that app?
Yeah, so imagine a world where you can download an app on your iPhone or Android, and let's call it Life ID, right?
Yeah.
And what it allows you to do is create as many identities as you want. Say one to log into LinkedIn, one to log into Twitter, one to log in with, VeraClouds or any company you want, right?
Yep.
But now you don't need passwords anymore, right? And then there's this other thing that comes along within the app where you're able to store information about yourself and then reuse it. Potentially something even like a proof from the Department of Motor Vehicles that you're over 21.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Or a proof that you work for a certain company when you go to apply to rent an apartment. Or just really think of any identity attribute that today requires a ton of paperwork for you to pass on, and then a company has to go verify that what you've provided to them is true, and that can be pretty expensive. So essentially what we're saying is, if you have some way to create identities that you own and control, and you have an app to store all those identities, and now organizations can issue certain information that is about you, and you can store it within that app, and then you can reuse that and present that digitally to others, what becomes possible? Things like, potentially, doctors proving that they're newly licensed to practice medicine in the state of Washington, and being able to prove that like very quickly, instead of in 3 months' time, be able to do that in like a day. Potentially businesses being able to prove that they are in active standing so that they can apply for a government RFP or contract. Like, we're talking about very quickly passing on information that is about you to some party that's asking for that information. And then on the back end, that party can very quickly determine that you've given them this credential about you. They can verify that it's true, it was issued to you, it wasn't some credential you took from someone else, it hasn't expired. And so the app becomes a place to store that kind of info.
Okay.
That's one way of thinking about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I keep going back to this idea. I'm working with digital wallets, because whenever we talk about digital wallets in the context of blockchain, cryptocurrency, we just think about the currency that's in there. But when you have a physical wallet, like I've got credit card in here, I've got pictures of family, all these other things. So a wallet's
driver's license and all this stuff.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I guess you could say that your app is going to be like a different kind of wallet, but for your identity rather than just the money.
Yeah, that's a wonderful metaphor, actually. Keep going.
But you could then, will you be able to, I guess, expand that? So could you also have like your financial, keep your financial information? I guess, then you could also have your financial records stored in the same place, and have a whole, make the physical wallet into the digital, sort of.
So I love the analogy you're making, because you're tying, this is part of the job of an evangelist, right? It's like, so you're evangelizing technology right now. Imagine that you have a way of proving, I'm a Chase customer. My bank is Chase. I'm over 21. I work for such and such company. I live in the state of Washington. Almost anything, or let's make things a little more concrete. All the info that's on a driver's license, your name, your address, your height, your eye color, your date of birth, like each of those pieces of information is stored in one thing on that card. If you lose that, you lose your ability to present all of that information in one fell swoop. If someone steals that, they gain a lot of information about you in one fell swoop. What if you could fragment each of those pieces of information, and then only present the bare minimum that is required? That's the kind of wallet that a self-sovereign identity-based protocol or platform enables. And then what that does is protect the user, because if one piece of information about them is compromised, the rest are protected. And it also means that the user has a way of passing that on to others, and then organizations don't have to store as much of all that information on their centralized servers as they do today. It's kind of like a win-win. So I think your idea of a wallet, but for information about you as a person, I think it's spot on.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this idea just gets cooler and cooler.
Yeah. But how you do that, in a way that's cryptographically secure and all that, that's the stuff of the self-sovereign identity underlying tech.
Yeah. I still feel like this is a really hard idea to wrap your head around. Like, I feel like at this point, most people take for granted that they're going to get hacked at some point.
Okay.
I mean, we've seen the Facebook hack, Equifax. Like, it's kind of, I know I personally had a lot of friends who were affected by the Equifax hack, and honestly just didn't really care that much. Like they really was sort of just like, oh well, I kind of knew, I have to call my bank account, I got to deal with this, it's a hassle or whatever, but they just sort of take it for granted. So I'm curious, like, how are you changing, or how do you think we can change the narrative around identity and get people to think, I don't know, get people to, there's obviously some interest in people having control over their data, but
Right.
how do we boost that and get people to, realize that it's possible for
Sure.
yeah, it is finally possible for them to be able to take that data back and retain
That's
control.
such a good question, and I don't know that I have like the answer for
Yeah.
that, but one of the things that's starting to happen, Seth, is that the realization of the value of data is starting to come into focus. People are starting to recognize that their data actually has a lot of value,
Yeah.
right? This is something that is fairly new to us, I think, because this digital age we're in, I keep going back to that 1993, mid-90s mark. It hasn't been that long. And so before that point, this concept of data about you is valuable in a digital context, kind of, this is my opinion, didn't really exist. And so
Yeah.
here we are, like flash forward 20-something years, and you've got very large technology companies who make a really large amount of money because the data that they have about users is super valuable. It's valuable to advertisers, it's valuable to partners of those companies, it's valuable to a lot of organizations. But users, I think, have not, by and large, been educated on just how valuable their data is.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's, I think, slowly starting to happen is we are, based on the news, we're starting to, as users, recognize, oh, this data about me is valuable.
Yeah.
It's being used. People are making money off of it. But I don't really have, as a user, the tools to monetize my data.
Yeah.
I heard of a university, I think Brown University has this cafe where the students can actually get free coffee. Instead of paying money for the coffee, they give up some of their data.
Oh, okay.
And
Interesting.
and then the cafe connects them with like recruiters and companies for internships and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's potentially kind of cool
It's an
because
interesting model.
you're educating people on the value that their data has.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of, that's a long-winded answer, but one of the things that's happening is we need to educate users on how valuable their personal data is.
Yeah.
Give them opportunities to capitalize on the value of that data. Give them the tools and the technologies, at least on the back end, to control and manage and own their data. And I think that would be a win-win for everybody.
Totally. That's I really like that example. I can't remember if it's LoyalCoin or, I heard of another project recently that's working with merchants to provide discounts to consumers who are willing to give up their data in a similar way. So but in a more transparent way, like at the point of sale. So it's not just like, you have to give me your data in order to access this service.
More of like it's not either or, it's
just an option.
Option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know as much as this, this issue has grown over the last 4 or 5 years, and it wasn't until a few months ago I remember coming across some article where some study somebody had done saying that the average American is worth about $80 worth of data to a company a year. Some I can't remember the exact metric, but it wasn't until I saw that I actually started thinking, okay, so that is, like, I know that my data was worth something, but that's how much, like, if I could find a way to monetize it myself, I'd have an extra $80 in my pocket.
Sure.
That's when I start thinking, okay, so how can I change this, or what services can I start using that allow me to keep the power, or keep accessing the services and products that I want to without having to give up all this extra data and make somebody else a buck.
So you mentioned $80, and let's go with that for now as an example. I wonder what the number is for the amount of money that a company is spending on keeping that $80 worth of data secure.
Yeah.
On their end.
Yeah.
On their servers, right?
It's funny you bring that up because that was another thing that got our train of thought that got me off on was I wonder how much redundancy is in all of that. So if you have 5 different companies, each of them have 1 million different users, like there's got to be a bunch of overlap within that.
There's that, right? And that data is like being stored in multiple places. And so, you think of it as from a risk standpoint, that means that users' information, which has value, is potentially at risk of someone else gaining access to and deriving some value from it.
Yeah.
But then there's also this piece of there's a cost, there's a capital cost for a business to protect user data, and then there are ongoing operating costs in keeping that data secure. And so, and in some cases, it's like the risk around that and the exposure around that is pretty significant. Companies are being fined a lot of money when there are data breaches.
So have you given much thought to what happens to companies that are reliant on data for their business model?
Yeah, so that's so here we are in 2018 in a world in which data is super valuable. Users are starting to recognize the value that data has. And it's not just like we use Google and LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter, et cetera. I mean, it's also like patient data. Are patients going to continue to learn how valuable their data is to researchers, to hospitals, to life science companies, et cetera? The reason this comes up is because I actually read about how would you architect a healthcare data marketplace that puts the patient in control over their medical data with blockchain technology underneath, ensuring that the information is that the infrastructure is secure and that the patients have the ownership and making sure the incentives are right. Anyway, this is top of mind. Like in that research, the researchers cited that a lot of patients don't recognize just how valuable some of that data is. So that's just top of mind. In general, that's the world we live in. Data has a ton of value. Users starting to know that. But businesses have built these business models that center around a very centralized approach to user data.
Yeah, that's where their money's at. They're not going to give it up easy.
So how do you either bootstrap a new way of doing that, where businesses win and the customers win, or how do you transition? I think that's what your question is getting at. I think one of 2 routes potentially. Either the market forces that we're seeing now around the cost of data breaches and around user trust having a negative impact on the betrayal of user trust when it comes to data. If that starts to have a lot of a negative impact on businesses will start looking for new ways of doing this, right? So there's a sort of a negative incentive. There's also a positive incentive to go proactively and say to users, you know what, we're actively employing technologies that put you in control, right? We think that's better for us, we think that's better for you. And then that creates trust, which I read the other day from somewhere, trust is at a premium. I think it's in a new book that I have. Then there's this other approach, which is, will challengers emerge in the market that are natively using privacy protecting technologies and technologies that put users at the center of their data and in control of their data, and are those challengers going to gain market share? So look at the Brave browser, right? Like,
cool example,
it's what I understand about it is users privacy is preserved. Advertisers, they have this basic attention token, and then advertisers are given a clear line of sight into which of their ads are high performing, without compromising user privacy, right, and preserving anonymity, of course. And so could in the future Brave be as popular or more popular as a browser than some of the browsers we have today. Like that's the route of challenger comes in and actually gobbles a market share, and from day one they're architected differently around how they manage data. So I don't know which of those 2 are gonna.
That's interesting, because I sort of see a third angle that people, Well, I mean, I think those are the realistic ways that it'll play out. But I see this other perception when you start talking about something like Facebook. One thing I remember hearing a lot out of the struggles that they've had getting hacked in the past year. People have said that Facebook and some of these other services like LinkedIn have become so important at this point to their lives that they talk about it in a way that seems like
too big to fail or something.
Yeah, too big to fail, or I sort of think about it as a utility. Like it's sort of shifted from being this like private business to being so important that it's we need this as a society, and people sort of treat it like they have a right to say like Facebook doesn't have rights to my data, forgetting that this is a service that they chose to use freely, and yeah, it's a business. They got to make their money too. So I guess what I'm getting to is like where's the
around.
At what point do private services sort of become utilities? Is there a point at which private services become utilities? Like, do you think it would be reasonable for a person to sort of force? Could you ever see a situation in which you think it'd be okay for someone to force a company like Facebook or LinkedIn to adopt something like SSI as like a issue of rights or something like that?
That's such a good question, and I feel like I've come across that in a different context and flavor. At the end of the day, businesses listen to their customers. I want to believe that that's by and large the case, right? Sure. And so now that users have more tools to voice their opinions about businesses, there's this kind of interesting thing we observe out in the world around how market forces shift as users are able to vocalize what they want, what their expectations are. And some of that, it's like I use Yelp often. Anytime I'm hungry, I by and large will pull out the Yelp app and see, okay, what's near me, and I look for the color. If it's red, I think it's 4 stars and up or so, that's what I'm looking at. And Yelp has created this really useful business model or infrastructure for me to be able to do that, but it's powered by, I hope, real people giving reviews, right? And so there's sort of this very indirect pressure that's put on businesses in the context of something like Yelp around having really awesome food and delivering great service, so that users, when they do voice their opinions about the business, it's a positive one, and that shows up in an in-app way to me as a brand new user. So do we get to a point where users have ways of voicing positive or negative opinions about businesses around identity? And if so, does that create kind of indirect pressure where I'm just thinking about, I'm just thinking out of the top of my head here, but like imagine that companies are scored by users kind of on a volunteer basis for how well they manage private data of users, right? And like I only use services that have 4 stars and up on how well they manage user data. Like maybe that's a world that would be interesting. But that, I think I've diverged. I don't know whether or not individuals can force companies, but I think the more tools companies give to users to capture users' will, right? To verbalize there's got to be a bridge between what exists today and what might exist in the future. And I don't know when we're going to cross that bridge, but it'd be interesting to see if over time companies do change because they're capturing the will of users in a new way.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of these technologies are suited to facilitate that. The expression from the sort of closing the gap between consumer and the business. Yeah. Because I mean, they at the end of the day, like you said, it's a mutual relationship. Neither of them will grow without the other.
Yeah. So, and I wrote as an addendum, I'm thinking about like governance smart contracts, right? Like, is there a way to create software where users have an incentive to voice how that software should evolve over time, and the software has been architected such that the will of the users absolutely will be implemented in how that software is upgraded over time.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that we don't really have today. Like, I don't really get to say how Lime or other companies that I use should upgrade their software. But what if I did? What if there was a way to do that using blockchain and smart contracts and tokens? That's kind of a cool world to think about.
Yeah, that's what I really enjoy reading about prediction markets for that reason. I think it's a really interesting technology. So we've talked a bit about how customers might think about, or think about their data in the context of the services they use. But I'm curious, where have you come, or what you've come across in terms of dealing with the regulatory side of implementing self-sovereign identity?
Yeah, so one of the cool things about this tech is that it's still evolving very much in real time. And you've got a lot of organizations that in the future could potentially benefit from, let's call it horizontal technology, right? It's kind of use case agnostic, it's back-end infrastructure, if you will, for things that in the future will benefit private organizations, public organizations, governments, regulators, consumers. Everyone's kind of essentially win once this technology is fully built out and powering a lot of current infrastructure. And so along with that, there's this, I think, need. In fact, I saw an article by a German organization. They put out a position paper last week, and it was around exploring self-sovereign identity technology, describing and explaining what decentralized identifiers are, and how the back end works around DADs and DAD documents and use cases. But one of my favorite things there was around a call to action. They said, regulators should look at this technology, learn how it works, and then provide some guidance around how this technology could be, say, GDPR compliant, right? How can, I was asked at a panel once about Real ID. So the Real ID Act came out some years ago, and it was around states making sure that driver's licenses that are issued comply with certain standards, right? For security reasons, right? And so in a future world where you've got self-sovereign identity credentials, can you issue credentials that are Real ID compliant, if you will? Things like that where you definitely want to have the people who know about the regulations kind of informing the builders of this cool new technology so that the technology itself will work within those frameworks. And so that's I don't know if that answers your question directly, but it's around all these voices and all these experts and areas of expertise need to come together to make sure the tech is implemented well in the future.
Cool. Yeah. And so what about I know you spend a lot, or have spent time on calls with various organizations working to create standards for the protocol governing self-sovereign identity. Who all is involved with that, and what's it like?
Yeah, so standards body work. Pretty fun, pretty cool. Like, it gives you an insight into how world-changing technologies actually make it out to market. So I was listening to some Hyperledger Fabric videos a couple of days ago, and the speaker was talking about how and why the Linux Foundation took over managing the evolution of Hyperledger Fabric, which is, for viewers, a private permissioned blockchain for enterprise. And so in the video, the gentleman was describing how the Linux Foundation and IBM and a lot of others helped to create this enterprise class blockchain. And one thing they said I really liked and resonated, and I've seen this to be true in the context of standards body work with decentralized identity, which is, you've got this technology, it's going to be used by a lot of different organizations and industries. Let's call it's horizontal technology, right? How do you ensure that kind of all their interests are met and that you architect the technology from the outset in a way that will work in many different contexts? And that's part of what standards body work is about, is ensuring that all those voices are captured as the technology is being built. Then there's this other component, which is how do you create the opportunity in advance or the likelihood that the technology will be adopted by a broad swath of institutions and industries.
Yeah.
And by having a lot of voices coming together around building the tech, that becomes possible. And then there's like technical interoperability, and that requires a lot of back-end conversation. And so my experience being with we joined the W3C community, World Wide Web Consortium, so global standards body for open web standards. And it's been really cool just to see how many organizations in many different countries are interested in making sure that the technology ends up working and ends up being implemented throughout.
Yeah, that's great. So how often do y'all speak?
In the W3C, there's a working group called the Verifiable Claims Working Group,
Okay.
and that's around like the data and syntax model, data model and syntax of verifiable credentials, which are packaged a certain way and presented a certain, and that work. So that group meets weekly. And then there's a community credentials community group that's actually been the one that's worked on the decentralized identifier standards. If you're building a self-sovereign identity protocol, then you have to architect the self-sovereign identities, the identifiers, a certain way, and those have to map to decentralized identifier documents and like all this kind of stuff. And so any organization building a self-sovereign identity protocol has to follow those standards, and the community credentials group is the one that defined those.
Yeah. That's okay. Interesting.
Yeah,
That's
like
cool
all this
seeing
stuff that happens behind the scenes, so
Yeah.
that really cool tech.
Yeah. When we always think about, especially building new businesses and technologies and stuff, I feel like we tend to think about it as a competitive situation. But I mean, there's a lot of times where you need, like you just said, you need these people to come together in order for it to have a chance for it to take off.
Totally.
If everybody's not involved, then you can't get. It's hard to get adoption.
Hard to get consensus, and adoption.
Yeah. So.
Hard to turn the ship. Otherwise.
Definitely. Man, so I know you've done a decent bit of traveling in your evangelism of blockchain and self-sovereign identity. So I'm curious, how does the scene compare in Seattle to like some of the places you've been? Yeah, what's it like? Is there the same level of enthusiasm?
So I'll say, like I said, it may appear as though I travel more than I do. I mean, this year I've been to Washington D.C., New York, San Antonio, Palo Alto, and Portland. Some of those were just for conferences that I was just an attendee, and a couple of those have been to actually speak. But I've had a lot of really cool conversations with a lot of fantastic people in many places. And the vibe that I'm getting is that pretty much universally, it's still really early. Like these are the early days in blockchain still. There's a lot of really hard work going on behind the scenes to bring this to the world. But I'm already starting to notice in conversations, there are certain cities that are starting to develop a presence of developers for particular blockchains, right? So like Research Triangle Park in North Carolina.
Home city.
Yeah. So IBM has a really strong presence there.
Yep.
And IBM is contributing a lot to the Hyperledger Fabric blockchain. And so Research Triangle Park, I've heard, has some 300, 400 Hyperledger Fabric developers. You don't quote me on that statistic, but that's a lot of devs for a particular chain, which is super awesome.
Yeah.
Here in the Seattle area, we've got T-Mobile. T-Mobile has been contributing to the Hyperledger Sawtooth project, and so what I hear is we have a Hyperledger Sawtooth developer community brewing here.
Yeah.
You hear about ETH San Fran just happened a few weeks ago, and 1,000 developers are there or something.
Yeah,
so
outrageous.
So what I'm hearing is it's still early, but there are definitely some regionalized differences emerging. And here in Seattle, I mean, it's an exciting place certainly to be around blockchain. Lots of startups, lots of developers. I think over the next year that'll only grow. And it's been really cool to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so another question I wanted to ask, because I'm always impressed by your LinkedIn posts, and I like that you do your Sunday reading list. That's always really helpful. Are there any standouts that you want to mention, or like what are you reading recently?
So I thought I don't know if oh yeah, my backpack is over here. So every Sunday I read about cryptography, and part of that is that for me to understand blockchain technology and how it works on the back end, I need to understand at least the basics of how cryptography works, right?
Okay.
How do you secure communication? How do we exchange and transmit data in a way that's secure? How does encryption work? How does decryption work? How do digital signatures work? One-way hashing, like all these things. When I joined the blockchain space, where it was just like totally arcane, right, to me, like totally unknown to me. So I dedicate time every Sunday to try to understand that. And I've got some other like reasons. There's some problems I want to help solve down the road that I think cryptography is going to be important to. So on Sundays, currently I'm reading Bruce Schneier's classic Applied Cryptography, second edition.
It looks pretty heavy duty.
It is really heavy duty, and I'm just starting, right? Yeah. But I would say for now, I have really enjoyed just understanding the basics.
Yeah.
Encryption, decryption, digital signatures, hashing. Learning like what makes Merkle Tree so useful.
Yeah.
Right. But this past weekend, I was reading some sections around secret splitting and secret sharing, and it's like, wow, like this. When you read how this stuff works, you can see there are some use cases in the digital era that are only possible if you're able to do those things right. And thinking, how does key management improve by using some of these protocols? Like those are the sorts of things that I think about on Sundays, and it's fun.
That's awesome. Cool. So, like to end on a bit of an uplifting note, started asking this question: what if there's one problem that you think blockchain could realistically solve, that you would like to see just taken out of the world tomorrow? What would it be?
Great question. So, I've got my favorites, but let me be more general in my response and say, if we can find ways to map abundance to scarcity, I think that in general will help us solve a lot of problems. You talk about food, I hear that 50% of all food is wasted. That's a statistic I've come across, and I haven't vetted it, but I've come across that. 50% of food is wasted. Wow, what if we had ways to reduce that waste, or to find more people who needed that resource, right? If we're able to use technology to reduce waste just in general in transportation of goods, if we're able to help find, and we don't need blockchain for all of this, but if we're able to help find the resources that people need in order to help them, like that alone, I think would be transformative. And I think blockchain and cryptography and self-sovereign identity technologies and a lot of other things will all come together, but we have to be willing to take what we know and apply that knowledge to ends that really help people, because that's ultimately why we're here.
Yeah, map abundance to scarcity. That's a great line. I like that.
Awesome.
Alex, thank you for being here.
Such a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Such a pleasure.
We'll do this again.
Thanks, Seth.